As we get into this week, we're just going to wrap up that backstory and kind of finish things up. So I think this is where we left last week. So we were talking about Absalom, and it's just absolutely wonderful drawing. I don't know who made it. But there's a revolt. Absalom has the secret plant that's in his army that's kind of giving him bad advice. Again, a lot of personality drama there, which is intriguing. You could do a lot with that one. So really quick, let's just kind of go through some of these. He loses Absalom, obviously, to that. Amnon is dead by the hands of Absalom. There's a second son David had by the name of Kileab. We don't know what happened to him. He basically just vanishes off the scene. Given the mortality rates through the years, it's not a surprise that he would have died just of natural causes, probably. So what we're doing is we're establishing this idea that Solomon is going to be the next legitimate ruler, and he's by no means the firstborn. And firstborn is dead by Absalom, secondborn is dead that way. Basically, we don't know. Third,
Solomon became king because Bathsheba made David promise.
In a way, yeah, we'll get to that, because basically it's a promise, and then the other son attempts to take over the throne. It's kind of a trend with David's family, and so in the process, that son is taken down, and so Solomon gets it. Next in line, so if you're following kind of this order of progression, the eldest gets the throne. It seems like the next in line, just by all this wrangling, would be Adonijah. So apparently he thought he was going to be the next in line for the throne. There were other sons. Some either died young or skipped over. So that's all possible. But what happens is Adonijah tries to take over. You're probably familiar with that story, and that goes swimmingly. There is another son of David by the name of Nathan, and so you will see Nathan the prophet. You'll see Nathan the son of David. So be careful not to confuse those two. Nathan will become an ancestor of Jesus, and so that's kind of an interesting little connection there. Solomon becomes the next king. He's also an ancestor of Jesus, and so if you follow the genealogies, you actually get two genealogies that both come down through David. And so one is more of the legal authority, one might be more of the biological connection. There's a few theories on where those two genealogies come from, and I don't know how much you've studied it, but here's the basic theories. Other than they got it wrong. Okay, that's stupid. But there's one genealogy that says maybe one of them is Mary's line, the other one might be Joseph's line. So they both kind of come down through different lineages through David. The more complicated theory, which actually might make more sense depending on how you look at it, back in the day there was this thing called levirate marriage. Have any of you guys heard of levirate? You know what I'm talking about. Okay, it's a complicated thing to kind of talk about, but it's rather easy to see in kind of a video format. I don't have the video on me right now, but I forget who it is. They put together a really good video kind of explaining it. So levirate marriage, what it is if you were, let's say, the eldest son, you got married and you didn't have any kids before you died. The next brother would marry your wife, and the first kid would be considered yours. So that's this whole idea of levirate marriage. So technically, like let's say my eldest brother Chuck, let's say he dies before he has a kid, and so his wife goes to me. My first kid is not my kid; it's Chuck's. That's how it's considered legally. Now biologically, it's mine, but legally, it's there. It's his, and that way his line could continue. So, sorry, Chuck. But that's how that would play out. Now.
My dad.
Now, if you look at the two genealogies, there seems to have been a levirate marriage at some point there. Maybe grandfather or great-grandfather level of Jesus, I think, is where they put it. So you're looking at some of those names, and you see a Mathat and a Mathan, and they seem to be brothers, but also one of them seemed to have died, and then the levirate marriage happened, and so you have one line that basically is Mathat, the other line is Mathan, and that's where that whole confusing mess happens. But that's how that would work. And so it's a neat idea. I'm not sure which one is right. I do lean more toward the levirate marriage idea than the Mary's line and Joseph's line, even though those are true as well. So anyway, that's how this lineage of David comes down through two different lines to Jesus. because you've got all that ancestry playing out there. So little bit of backstory there. This is a quote from Sue Sandridge. She did a book on David. She says this: "This brings the number of David's sons who are mentioned by name in the Bible to 19. The number doesn't include David's daughters, whose name the Bible does not give, except for Tamar's. If the reader has trouble keeping all these children straight," in which case the reader is referred to the appendix where blah, 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 "the reader may find consolation in the fact that David himself often couldn't seem to keep track of all of them." So the fact is, there were a lot of kids. When David had multiple wives, multiple children, good luck. He probably didn't have a huge role in some of their lives. So again, different culture, some weird things there. Again, a lot of the stories are seemingly told in chronological order, but there are times in Jewish literature where it's not so concerned with the chronological order, it's more concerned with a theme. So it's building on a theme, and so you might see some of the stories pop in and out. David brings the ark to Jerusalem, and so what this is doing is this is kind of that weird twist as we study the life of David, where yes, he completely failed as a father. Like as a dad, he was a mess. But he still was a man who loved God. He still was a man who was very obsessed with the worship of God and glorifying God. And so it's just kind of that weird contradiction in our mind where we're like, well, I mean, if you struggle in this area, you must not be a good Christian. And it's like, I mean, you might still be. It just, we have our weaknesses. We have our areas that we are prone to danger in. We just got to keep those areas in mind. Now, David, his happened to be his kids, and sometimes you don't find that one out until later. You know, it's like, oh, I totally blew raising that one. Now they're a teenager. It's kind of hard to turn the ship when it's in full motion. And so David brings the ark to Jerusalem. It does stop along the way. You guys remember that story. Even in this, David kind of ignored some of the commands. He wasn't supposed to bring the ark. He wasn't supposed to put it on a cart. There was all those stories. God blesses him instead. You know, like in spite of all this, he has a palace. He has a large family. Again, this is, you think about where Israel came from. You know, they're wanderers. They're nomads. They're packing up their temple every time they have to move it and settling it again. And so their tabernacle really is a big tent thing. And so David is blessed, and he actually gets to have a nice house, which again is unique. You know, they moved into the land. They moved into the houses that were already there. I'm kind of curious if they were a little big for them because they're giants, but I don't know how that worked. And so you've got the buildings that they kind of moved into, but David actually gets a palace, and in so doing so, he starts thinking, and he goes, "I'm living in a palace. God's living in a tent. That doesn't seem right." And so you can start to see David's heart, where David says, I want something equally nice to what I have for God. He's a warrior as well. We understand this. I mean, he's constantly out there battling the Philistines, just violence and bloodshed, but he's a man of war. You got that, okay? But in this, he desires to build a temple. And so he calls for the prophet, and he says, hey, I want to build a temple to the Lord. I don't think it's right that I have a palace and God doesn't. So I want to build him a permanent dwelling. This is an interesting one, because this is one of those situations where the prophet doesn't inquire of the Lord. It just seems like the right thing to do. And so he's like, oh yeah, like, sure, let's go for it. Like, and it's kind of an interesting part of the story, because the prophet doesn't say, I'll ask God and I'll come back to you. He says, oh man, I mean, that's a great idea. And like, he leaves, and then God gets his attention, and he's like, actually, sorry, I spoke out of turn. And so that's just kind of interesting. There are times, a quick spiritual application of that, there are obviously times where something seems to be the right choice, but we may still want to pray about it. Like, God may still say no, because it may not be what he wants us doing right then. So anyway, the interesting thing is, though, God says, I'm not going to have you build a temple, David. You're a man of war. You're a man of bloodshed and all that. So I'm not going to have you do this. However, since I didn't ask and you just volunteered, I'm actually going to build you a house. And so he basically says, I will make sure one of your kin, like your kids, always is on a throne. Now that is fulfilled spiritually. It's not necessarily like you will have a never-ending reign of kings, because that does actually get cut off at some point. But there you go. Solomon is promised that Solomon will be the one who builds the temple. And it's interesting because Solomon gets the credit, but who laid aside all the supplies? David. I mean, so David, he gets all the wood and he gets all this other stuff. Now, obviously Solomon made it way, way better. But when you kind of come into your rulership and you're like, ooh, I've got this massive stockpile of supplies for this project, I get credit for it. Kind of cool. Now, wrapping up, hopefully. David does act foolishly. So there's a few areas where David does some really bad stuff. God said, don't be consumed with this type of stuff, but David does. He orders a census. So that brings some judgment. Like I said, David can't build a temple, so he starts stockpiling supplies. And then this is one final little thing. So Solomon would have been alive. He would have probably been nearing adulthood, and his father is getting really, really old. And there's some things that start to happen at the end of David's life that we just kind of scratch our head at, and we're like, what is that? Like, that's just weird. So, and this is going to play into how Solomon gets to be king. As David ages, he can't keep his warmth. So he's an old man. He's kind of wearing out. He's just kind of like, I'm cold all the time. So he's like, I need you to find me a young virgin who just can kind of be here next to me and keep me warm. Okay. And it makes a big deal that, like, she wasn't there for a sexual purpose. She was there just simply for warmth and kind of comfort. And you're kind of like, what? But again, we have to understand we're reading a book that's written in a completely different culture. There's things that happen that you're like, sure. And now there'll be Bible scholars who are like, well, I mean, he just needed, a young person to have sex with. And it's like, no, I mean, it's very clearly simply I just need a comfort. I need someone who's just taking care of me. So that seems to be what this is. Now, this is going to play a role because she would be considered, I don't know that you would consider her part of David's harem. But basically, she belongs to the king, okay? So not just anyone could come along and be like, well, I'm going to go marry Abishag. It's like, no, to marry her or to have her, so to speak, you're going to have to be a king. Like, you're going to have to be royalty. This is why it's such a big deal, because when Adonijah comes along and he wants to marry her, that is taken as a coup attempt, because she only would belong to someone who was the king. And so that's where this thing is included, and then you see it come up with Adonijah, because when he says, I want to marry her, it's not just, we're in love. It's I am now going to own that person who only belongs to someone who's the king. And that's why it's taken so seriously. So there are things in our culture where we pay attention, we're like, so what? Like, I don't care. I mean, so she's a princess or a, court assistant, whatever. Okay, but it's a really big thing back then. That's a serious crime, so to speak. Now, David is going to die in about 970 BC. It's kind of hard to nail down some of these dates just for various reasons, but we estimate this. Now, as David dies, this is where it gets kind of, like I said, when you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, there's a lot of times where you just kind of feel sick to your stomach. Like, there's things that happen that you're just like, ugh, like, these are the good guys? Ugh, like, this is rough. So what happens with David is, it's clearly a not smooth transition. So Adonijah tries to usurp the throne. Nathan the prophet helps Bathsheba bring a plan to David, and so this is where Bathsheba, David doesn't know about Adonijah trying to usurp the throne. So Bathsheba comes and she's like, will you promise that Solomon will be the next in line? And so there's this manipulation and some stuff going on. She points out that Adonijah has taken the throne and that Joab has joined up with him. So now you've got one of David's sons who's trying to take the throne. You've got one of David's generals who's trying to help him out there. And Joab has kind of cast his lot in and done a lot of things through the years that are not so good. And so David's finally going to be like, all right, I've let this happen for long enough. I'm about to die, so might as well take care of all of these messes. And again, long story short, David is going to have Solomon take over the throne. So you've got this uproar of Adonijah trying to work his way into the throne. Joab is helping him out. David's just kind of out of it. I mean, he's old and weak and feeble. And so you've got kind of a coup attempt. And so Bathsheba, again, might be some self-preservation here going on. You don't know. I mean, normally when there's a coup attempt, the other relatives don't fare so well. And so it could be very well Bathsheba going, the only way to save my life is to make sure my son's the one on the throne. So I'm not going for this. And so you've got all this palace intrigue. Solomon will act wisely. Adonijah is killed and all of that good stuff. And so, I know, I'm not trying to get into detail. Now, the interesting thing is, as David is dying, he basically says, Solomon, I need you to act wisely, and I need you to take out a few people for me before I die. And as you rule, that there's just going to be a few people I need you to go kill for me. And you're like, what? It's like, for my last will and testament, so-and-so threw a rock at me one time. I want them dead. So-and-so did bad to me a lot. I want them dead. Oh, by the way, don't let this guy's gray hair go down to the grave alive. What? And so basically he's like, assassination list. There you go. Go for it. And so, again, this is the example Solomon has. This is the world Solomon is dropped in. I mean, palace intrigue, adultery, coup attempts, multiple coup attempts. I mean, his just not a good condition. And then, like, your first command as you take over king is go kill these guys. Now, there is wisdom to some of this stuff, but there's also, I don't know. I don't know what other reason. It just seems strange at times. The one that I've personally struggled with at times is David says to Shimei, like, I forgive you, like, God let you be this to me. And then as David dies, he's like, by the way, kill Shimei. And you're like, so I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting one. Solomon, I think, deals with it wisely. So Shimei, if you don't remember the backstory here, he's the guy who basically chucked rocks and dirt and cussed out David as David was escaping from Absalom. So Shimei is not a good man, okay? Probably the only reason he came and apologized because he realized, ooh, I backed the wrong horse. Like, there probably wasn't some genuine repentance on Shimei's part. So he did deserve death for what he did to David. Like, David's own general said, can I go kill this guy for you? And David's like, no, God's ordained him to do this. But then David said, but I'm going to remember. And you're like, okay, don't be on the bad side of him.
I wouldn't kill you.
Yeah, exactly. And that might be part of it. Maybe he just kind of lingered there and was like, I won't do it. Campaign promise. I kept it. And I don't know. I don't know what the deal is. But basically what happens is Solomon goes up to Shimei and he basically says, so you did some really bad stuff to my dad. I'm not going to kill you, but I'm also going to put you on city arrest, which means you can never leave this city again. If I catch you outside this city, then I'm going to kill you. And he stays in that city for about 3 years, if I remember correctly. And then he leaves to go grab something, and then he comes back, and Solomon's like, yeah. So remember I said, if you leave the city, I'm going to kill you? You left the city. Okay, you're dead. And that's basically what Solomon does. So he carries that one out. And so you have a little bit of pity for Shimei, because you're kind of like, But he did kind of bring it on himself, that I don't know if they didn't have DoorDash back then or whatever, but he had to go get the food himself. And so that was his mistake. I don't have a whole lot of pity for Joab, and you kind of look at what he does throughout the years of his life, and he's constantly stirring up trouble. He's constantly like, oh, you're a threat to my power. And you're like, David, why didn't you deal with him like 40 years ago? And it's like, well, I mean, he was a useful guy. And as David is dying, he's like, you're no longer a useful guy, so you're going to die. And so Shimei, that's what happened to him. Joab, just to kind of remind you, he had killed Abner. So back when David first kind of coalesced the kingdom into one thing, Joab had been the guy who, remember the smote him under the sixth rib? That one came up a lot with Joab. And then he killed Amasa. He sided with Adonijah, and so Joab just kind of did enough stuff where David is like, all right, I've overlooked enough of this. You're done with. Okay? And so Adonijah is put to death, like I said, for asking Abishag as his wife. That wasn't just I love her. It was a coup attempt. Okay? Abishag was considered to be royal property, to put it crassly. Basically, no one could have her but someone who was a king. Like someone who was royalty and deserved to be ruling. So that. Okay? And so there you go. That's that. Okay? So now King David dies, and Solomon is set up. Now this is where we start getting into the wisdom of Solomon. Now you guys probably know this story already. We've kind of covered a lot of stuff you already know. Hopefully I put it in context that maybe you didn't hear before. Makes some of the stories come out as more sense. Solomon doesn't know how to rule. Okay? Again, just imagine inheriting like an entire state and saying, you're complete in charge of this. You do not have a cell phone, and you have no way to instantly communicate across this state. Rule it. What? Oh, by the way, you're like 20. Sure. Oh, by the way, you just removed all of your siblings and other contenders for the crown, so your rulership might not be as strong as you think it is right now. So yeah, take that into account. And your dad's dead. Okay. And it's just not a good situation for Solomon. I mean, he's kind of like, I don't know what's going on. And so he starts offering sacrifices. And I mean, it is unbelievable when you start looking at the number of sacrifices he offers. And God appears to him. Again, you've heard this story. He asks, what do you want? And Solomon basically says, I'm a child. I don't know how to rule. I need wisdom. So God gives him an unbelievable amount of wisdom, also gives him wealth, gives him power, gives him all of that stuff. And so Solomon is going to demonstrate throughout his life his amazing wisdom. And so you get stories all throughout, where you got the one with the little baby and the prostitutes both have a baby and one rolls over on her baby, which I'm like, how do you do that? But I've slept with a baby on my chest. I can't imagine like how you could be that out cold and not feel that the baby was anyway. So I don't know. Maybe she was drunk. But whatever happens, she rolls over onto her baby and kills it. And so she swaps the dead baby with her neighbor's baby. And I don't know if you realize this. Parents tend to have a fairly good grasp of what their baby looks like. You're not like, what? Who's that? It's normally pretty obvious. You're like, I know what my baby is. So she thinks she can pull that one off, but other people might not because all babies are ugly. And so you're looking at the baby going, this is mine. And the other person's like, no, it's mine. And so if you go up to a complete stranger and you're like, this is my baby, and they're like, no, it's my baby. It's like, I don't know which one's your baby. I don't care. And so Solomon has this mess brought to him. And it's a first demonstration of his wisdom because he basically says, all right, well, so you want the baby? Yeah. You want the baby? Yeah. Okay. So here's the solution we're going to have. We're going to cut the baby in half. You get half the baby. You get half the baby. So then you both have the baby. That good? And so the one woman whose baby it isn't, she's like, no. Like, sorry. The one woman whose baby it isn't, basically it's like, sure, go ahead. I cut it in half. I don't care. I mean, she already killed her baby, so she doesn't care. But the baby whose mom it is, because she's a mom, she actually cares. And so she's like, oh no, I'd rather her have the baby than to kill it. And so Solomon, in just seeing that simple little fact, goes, okay, I know which baby the mother's is. Give it to her. And so that's how he solves it, because he kind of understood, that's the concern a mother has for a baby. Now, is that like unbelievably amazing wisdom? I mean, it's pretty good. I don't know if it's like the most earth-shattering wise thing ever. Like, no, none of us could ever have thought of doing that. But okay, it's pretty good for, I mean, just think about how many of you, could have just come up with that one off the top of your head. You probably would have been like, well, maybe we can find some family members who kind of know this baby, and they're gonna lie and say the baby's cute, because we all know that newborn babies are ugly. Only their parents think they're cute, and it's true. It's true. All right. Some other things. Solomon will construct the temple. It'll take him about 11 years to do that. I'm going to get in trouble for that last comment. He's going to build a big, grand palace, which is amazing because his palace is so grand, they actually have to expand the city, because it's like, my house is too big. I need a bigger town to live in. And so they just build a bigger town. They dedicate the temple. God accepts the dedication. Now, this is interesting because he's going to warn the punishment for disobedience and the blessings for obedience. So it's kind of this twofold sword of like, if you obey, I will bless you. If you disobey, you will receive cursing. And we see that play out in the life of Solomon because that's exactly what happens. All right, we'll finish up just a little bit more, and then we will call it. Solomon, again, we've summarized Solomon's whole life right now. He will build tons of stuff. He will use conscripted slave labor to do it. So he will have servants, and he'll talk about that in Ecclesiastes. He will become so well known that people will come to visit him to kind of seek out his wisdom. So one specific one is the Queen of Sheba. Now this gets really fun. The Queen of Sheba comes, and there's actually rumors that she may have taken the Ark of the Covenant back with her. And so that's where the Ark of the Covenant is now, because Solomon gave it to the Queen of Sheba. Okay, well, the Bible doesn't say that. But that is like one of the legends that's like, where is the Ark of the Covenant? And it's like, it's where the Queen of Sheba went back to. So whatever. There's no biblical proof for that one that I know of. If you know of it, let me know. All right, he's going to gain much. So the Bible actually talks about the trade deals that he makes and the unbelievable wealth flowing into Israel. But he does have one very, very prominent weakness. Anybody know what his major weakness is? Women. All right. Again, this is where, like I told you last time, I get the number backwards because I can't remember. All right, it's either 700 wives and 300 concubines or vice versa. Either way, he has about 1,000 wives. Okay, basically a concubine is just like a lesser wife. I mean, it basically is. All right, it's what this is. These are political marriages. Okay, it's Solomon attempting to make trade deals and political deals and peace deals and wheels and deals, all of that. Now, some early on ones probably seem to be love-based. I mean, read the Song of Solomon. There's definitely some hardcore infatuation going on there. And, I love my beloved, and my beloved loves me. The Song of Solomon is a love story. That's if you're wondering what the Song of Solomon is all about, it's a love poem. That's it, all right? There are a lot of people who are like, well, it shows Jesus' love for the church. Okay, if it does, the apostles missed that one because they never referenced the Song of Solomon ever in referencing Jesus' love for the church. So I'll leave you with that. Sorry, that's one that kind of bugs me sometimes because they're like, oh, it's just showing how much God loves the church. And it's like, or it's a love poem.
Now,
Now,
why is it in the Bible?
because it's a love poem. And it's showing that sex is not bad. That's basically it. It's a love poem. I mean, it's there, and it's a celebration of a king and his love for his wife. Now, can you make some metaphorical comparisons to Jesus' love for the church? Yes, you definitely can. But I would just be very, very careful in how far you take that. Just read the Song of Solomon, and you'll find out why I say that. All right, but to my knowledge, no apostle ever used the Song of Solomon as a metaphor. It's a love poem. I mean, that's what it is. So there are clearly times where Solomon was genuinely in love with his wife, because that's what the Song of Solomon is all about. So anyway, there you go. Now, his other wives, so he will marry Pharaoh's daughter, he will marry all sorts of other wives. His wives will start to drag him away to serve other gods. Now, I bring this all up, not only to mention the danger of that, so don't marry 1,000 people, but there are times where if you look in the book of Proverbs, you start to see proverbs that look like they were pulled straight out of like Egyptian wisdom literature. That actually could potentially be the case, because if you marry Pharaoh's daughter, guess what you have access to? Pharaoh's library. And guess what's in Pharaoh's library? Egyptian wisdom literature. And so it's not wrong to say like, hey, that poem right there speaks the truth. I'm going to take it. Like, That actually happens throughout the Bible. I told you on day one of this whole study, because there are times where Paul will literally grab a pagan poem, he'll yoink it and say, I'm just going to change the name here from Zeus to Jesus, and there you go. And so the pagan poem will be like, hey, Zeus, in whom we live and breathe and have our being. And Paul's like, I like that. But you got the name wrong. Jesus, in whom we live and breathe and have our being. And you're like, but he just ripped off a pagan poet. Yeah, because the statement is still true if you change the name. And there are times where he'll talk about like, your Cretan poets, they say that, you are always glutton, evil beasts, slow bellies, basically. You're lazy, violent, and gluttonous. Yeah, they actually speak the truth. So stop it. I mean, that's basically what Paul's doing. He's quoting pagan literature that people would have known at the day, and he's saying, just so you know, that actually is a true statement, so stop it. And so Paul will do that a lot. He'll be like, oh, look, I saw this statue over here to the unknown God. Can I tell you about the unknown God? And so he pivots from this myth they had to truth, and he's using it as an illustration. Another place where this happens, in the book of Enoch. Okay? It was a book that was really, really popular around Israel during Jesus' day. Along comes Jude, and Jude hops back and forth between Bible story and one of those more apocryphal stories that potentially could have come out of the book of Enoch. Back to a Bible story, back to an apocryphal story, back to a Bible story, back to an apocryphal story. And he's building a case to talk about what God's going to do and the judgment God's going to bring on sinners. And he's hopping back and forth between, apparently, actual biblical sources and a source that was really well known at the time. And he's just seamlessly hopping back and forth between the two of them. And so the idea that there's foreign literature in the Bible. I mean, do you think they were completely isolated from all culture around them? And that's why God warned them, because they were so surrounded by these false cultures. He's like, be careful that you're not drawn away to worship their gods. But truth is truth. And so if this poem or if this bit of literature came out of Egypt, that's fine. I mean, if it's true, it's true. All right? And so here's to kind of give you an idea of why this is so. So right here, this is where Solomon is going to be reigning. But look at all these main travel routes and how they all came pretty much right through here. And so you've got the King's Highways, you've got all of these nice caravan routes coming up and through. And so that's why Israel is such a hot spot of both warfare and trade and other things. Because basically, if you want to get down to Egypt, you pass through Israel. If you want to get up into kind of the Arabian area, you pass through Israel. If you want to get up and around without taking a boat, you come up through Israel. And so that's why this thing's going to be just this hotbed of education and learning and trade and warfare. And Solomon is going to use this to his advantage to expand Israel's borders like nobody's business. Now, as he does this, he's trying to figure out what life's all about. He's trying to figure out the point of life. He's trying to figure out what brings satisfaction. And as he keeps doing this, that's where the book of Ecclesiastes is going to start getting written. Okay? Now, as Solomon does these bad things, God is going to respond. God said, if you honor me and obey, I will bless you. If you disobey, I will curse you. And God will begin to stir up trouble. So, really simple things as you read the accounts, where it'll be like, he sends a condolence, or he kind of like, oh man, I'm so sorry to hear. And someone takes it the wrong way, and now there's a stirring up of trouble because they don't trust that his intentions are pure. And so they're like, I think he's going to try to take us over. Let's fight him. Or there's a place where Solomon will win a battle, and this one guy survives, and God stirs him up to be an enemy of Solomon's. And so you start seeing internal and external threats because Solomon has not been living for God. Solomon has been trying to pull his own wisdom in order to keep peace. God's like, just so you know, I'm the one who will give you peace. You don't have to do this on your own. And because you've chosen this route, I am going to actually stir up enemies in your midst. He will rip the kingdom away, but he says, because I made a promise to David that I would keep someone on the throne, I will let you keep basically 2 tribes. And then once Solomon dies, due to some really, really bad advice, his son causes a split. And so basically Israel was a united kingdom for about 3 kings. So Saul, David, and then Solomon. Okay, so that is a conclusion of the backstory of Solomon. So next week we'll get into the text proper and start actually digging into all the meanings here and some of the stuff going on. You'll see a timeline in your notes. This is a simplified timeline to just kind of give you an idea of what major things happen in Solomon's life. Your notes will have them on page 5. I know, 3 hours in and we're on page 5. I'm sorry, we will move faster. All right, these dates are approximate because, like I said, when you're dealing with these kind of dates, it is kind of hard to nail down specifics. Basically, what they're doing is they're building it off of, when was the Exodus? You've got so many years from the Exodus to Solomon. You've got so many years from Solomon to and you can kind of piece together from archaeology and other things and get some rough estimates here. But again, the last judge, to kind of put it in perspective, so Judges ends with Samuel being the last major judge. That's 1100 BC. He'll rule for a while. Again, some of these are estimates, like I said. So Saul becomes king in the 1000 BC. David becomes king a little bit later than that. Some of these come down to translation issues as well. So King James is going to translate it's 40 years that Saul ruled. And so you can kind of say okay, then that would have to tweak some of these. Some of the other translations don't translate. So it's when Saul had reigned X years. And you're oh, good translation. Good job there. You didn't think the 40 years was right, so you replaced it with nothing. Sure. But some others will replace it with when Saul reigned 1 year, and then he reigned 2 years. And you're okay. And so there's various reasons for some of those, but that's why some of these dates would flex a little bit. 1003, 90, and so you kind of come all the way up. And so by the time David is dead, all right, you can kind of see the distance in time from 1100 to 970 BC. And that's when a lot of this stuff will happen. And so that's just kind of your short summary. And so most are going to date the writing of Ecclesiastes to somewhere within this period, toward the end of Solomon's life. So 930 to 940 BC potentially. Again, we're not positive. The one thing to keep in mind as you are looking at BC dates is the smaller they are, the closer they are to the birth of Christ. So I had a student one time who just could not grasp the concept of BC, and they're what? And so 1100 BC is an older date than 900 BC, just in case you have not taken that history yet. So that is kind of the history of Solomon's life. So that way, as we build on his biography, which is Ecclesiastes, we can grasp that. I may play it next week. I don't know. We'll see if it works. I know internet's kind of sketchy right there. But if you want to get kind of a good summary of it, there's a YouTube channel called The Bible Project. And so some of you have probably been exposed to The Bible Project. They have a really good one on Ecclesiastes. Like I said, I don't agree with every one of their conclusions, but it is a fairly good summary of the events, and it's drawn out, which is really cool. And then they also summarize, I believe it's their one on 2 Samuel or 1 Kings. I'm not positive on that one, but they summarize the end of David's life, and it's really good. So those are worth watching if you want to kind of get ahead for next week. But there you go. All right. So we've covered a lot this week, but I think the biggest one is just this idea of relying on God, letting Him be the source of our blessing. I think that would be a good spiritual takeaway for the week, because Solomon had that. God gave him all these blessings, but then he started acting in his own wisdom a little bit too much, and he justifiably could act in his own wisdom. He had a lot, but again, recognizing where it came from and then submitting to God to say, maybe I don't need to, marry all these women to secure peace for the kingdom. Maybe that's not what I need. Because apparently he missed one. And could have 1,001st. I mean, that could have been, no, that's not how it works, all right? And so God allowed this trouble to stir up. And there are times where God does that, where he's like, if you're going to live this way, I'm going to remove my hand of protection. Now don't take that too far, because then you'd be like, well, every time something bad happens in my life, it means God's removed his hand. Okay, Solomon clearly had a lot of bad stuff happen in his life that wasn't his fault. But toward the end of his life, he had a lot of bad stuff happen that was his fault. So just kind of a little bit there. And before we close, let's just take any questions or comments you might have.